In December 2024, prominent music YouTuber Finn McKenty, also known as the punk rock MBA, gave an interview to Jesse Lee in which he revealed that most of his videos on different bands and scenes were lifted from Wikipedia.
Dude, I can't make content. I don't know, like the encyclopedia history of all these bands. But
well,
you
neither do I. Just literally look it up on Wikipedia.
This left many in the YouTube music sphere scrabbling to upload their take. Because I'm always right, I didn't need to do this. In January 2024, in a stink piece entitled Why You Should Hold Metal in Contempt, lambasting metal content culture, I said the following. The dustbin of history is equally suitable fodder for the dark satanic content mills. Countless blogs, YouTube channels, zines, and review sites publish guides to lost demos from forgotten scenes, exhaustive lists of overlooked bands, or entirely redundant genre primers. See Banger TV's Overkill Global series, presented with the light-hearted professionalism of a kids' TV program, or Punk Rock MBA's superfluous metal starter packs. Banally dispassionate list of albums that no one genuinely seeking a beginner's guide to death metal is actually watching. Or, to take a non-metal example, the Trash Theory YouTube channel, all forms of slick, sometimes well-researched content, but little more than Wikipedia pages with charisma for all the novel perspectives they bring to the subject matter. McKenty also revealed that he had no interest in music in this interview.
Because I don't really have any interest in music, so I was just doing it for the money.
That bands were a lost cause, and that he was quitting YouTube because he'd met his financial goals.
And I hit my financial goals.
Whatever that means. These were deliberately provocative claims that no doubt achieved their goal, and much like a single tweet from Elon Musk can set the parliamentary agenda of a sovereign nation for entire weeks, a slice of the internet danced to McKenty's tune for days. Because I'm always right, I didn't need to do this. In 2019, I wrote an essay on one of his videos called Why Do People Like Black Metal, in which I said, the real truth bomb here is what it reveals about how some people view underground music, and in this case it's viewed as a branding tool, a marketable product, something we can poach for ideas on how to stand out in a competitive market. This is not the language of someone that has any interest in music as art, in music as a community, an identity. This is not even the language of a marginally interested journalist. No, for McKenty, music is capitalism, a neat little product you can use to improve your brand. It's the language of a sales guru. Hello, and welcome to my talk on why I'm always right. By admitting that he gets most of his information from Wikipedia, McKenty drew attention to something I've long suspected about his brand of YouTube content, the genre starter packs, the band and scene histories, and other adjacent content based on trivia more than well-articulated opinion and genuine investigative journalism. And that's that basically anyone with an internet connection, a camera, and some video editing skills can cobble together a channel and a brand by rewording Wikipedia articles. Whatever the motivation for lashing out at his viewer base, McKenty's revelations are but a minor symptom of what many would call the death of the underground. This conceives of underground scenes as walled-off cultural zones, replete with obscure and difficult-to-obtain knowledge, whose doors have suddenly been thrown wide open by the internet, allowing anyone to appropriate this knowledge as they wish. And if they're smart enough, there's some real money to be made here. Enough for branding guru Finn McKenty to have met his financial goals, apparently.
And I hit my financial goals.
But when the borders of metal are so porous, the bar of accessing its most arcane secrets so low, when the time, dedication and commitment required to discover small artists all evaporate beneath a broadband connection, when access to vast quantities of music and information is instantaneous and unchecked, this to many spells the death of the underground. It's a refrain I see come up repeatedly in the metal sphere, and it's certainly a tempting proposition. But before we sign the underground's death certificate, we should maybe push back on it a little. First, it's worth asking what we actually mean by the underground. Well, in the spirit of Finn McKenty, let's start by asking Wikipedia, which states that underground music is music with practices perceived as outside or somehow opposed to mainstream popular culture. Underground styles lack the commercial success of popular music movements and may involve the use of avant-garde or abrasive approaches. The article later references cultural theorist Martin Raymond, who agrees with the claim that the underground no longer exists because trends in music are now transmitted laterally and collaboratively via the internet. You once had a series of gatekeepers in the adoption of a trend. The innovator, the early adopter, the late adopter, the early mainstream, the late mainstream, and finally the conservative. But now it goes straight from the innovator to the mainstream. This claim, appealing as it is, ignores the first feature of underground music, that they involve practices perceived as outside of or opposed to mainstream pop music, and involve avant-garde or abrasive approaches. In other words, just because something is accessible to everyone, going straight from the innovator to the mainstream, as Raymond claims, this does not mean that everyone wants this access. Extreme metal is undoubtedly more popular than it ever has been, and this in part is because it is more available and visible than ever. But I think a lot of people often forget that this popularity is still minuscule when measured against the actual mainstream ecosystem. The overwhelming majority of people will still look at extreme metal, if they see it at all, and think, no thanks to all of that. The idea that extreme metal is now overrun with normies is based on vibes more than anything. This isn't vaporwave. For every normie that happens to stumble onto an extreme metal playlist on Spotify, there are dozens that don't know or care about extreme metal, and even more that would recoil in disgust if they knew about it, and yet more that would find it incomprehensible or outright stupid. Transylvanian Hunger, despite being in its 30s by this point, is still a deeply confusing prospect for the overwhelming majority of people, even amongst those who broadly identify as lovers of diverse music. So, based on the Wikipedia article, there seems to be two different conceptions of the underground coming into focus here. The first concerns infrastructure. How do people access music? How easy is it to access? How much time are people willing to spend looking for it? And what is the size and makeup of the communities that form around it? All elements driven by technology, i.e. means of distribution and communication, and economics and social trends. The second focuses on the music itself. If there is such a thing as mainstream culture in the 2020s, I don't know, Swift. How far does underground music run counter to this? Does it try, consciously or unconsciously, to alienate listeners by running counter to mainstream tastes, whatever they may be? For example, extreme metal does this by operating at extremes of volume, distortion, complexity, and speed, and so on. So, these two distinct features of underground music are not mutually exclusive, they simply put the emphasis in a different place. The first we'll call socially underground, which understands the concept chiefly through the lens of social and economic factors, i.e. the bar of access. The second we'll call artistically underground, which focuses on the music itself when compared with popular tastes. Is the music anti-mainstream in substance? Trying really hard not to say the music's ontology here like a video essay as coach. What we're really asking here is, can something be considered underground if it exhibits only one of these facets? What happens when ontologically anti-mainstream music is made available to a wider public? Something like this process happened to a genre of music called death metal back in the early 90s, when the powers that be in the music industry tried to make a mainstream cash cow out of this defiantly underground form of music. It had bizarre and disastrous consequences. So, what happened? I'd argue that death metal was rock's first truly underground subgenre. By this, I mean it was fashioned from the underground much like heavy metal, punk, thrash and hardcore before it. But unlike those other genres, death metal was simply not translatable into a mainstream version of itself, despite a concerted push to achieve just this in the early 90s. Punk bands, for example, were appearing on Top of the Pops as early as 1977. Heavy metal morphed into a stadium-filling behemoth by the 80s, ditto thrash by the late 80s, and hardcore... Yeah, okay, hardcore stayed underground, but unlike death metal, it was never regarded as fit for mainstreaming by the tastemakers of the music industry. The best most artists could hope for was a cult success or else drastically rebranding to hit the big time. Think Beastie Boys or Chumbawamba, for example. But let's ignore this as it doesn't fit my argument. How did death metal go from a loose, informal coalition of like-minded individuals whose music was both socially and artistically underground to a cultural force popular enough to appear on primetime TV? Hollywood films and major record labels? And why was it just as quickly and dramatically jettisoned from this mainstream environment? I won't be offering a history of death metal here. If you need Finn McKenty to read Wikipedia articles to you, you have my condolences. Instead, I want to examine this question through the process of professionalisation, the idea that death metal had a specific and unique work ethic, one that catapulted it from its parents' basements and garages into the professional recording studio, MTV, and the minds of concerned parents everywhere. Of course, all underground genres have a work ethic of some kind, an ethos which drives people to work at creating music and a scene around it that goes far beyond economic self-interest and sometimes exists in rampant defiance of this. But often, commercial success, if it does arrive, is a byproduct of this work ethic, and it's naively accepted, often with unintended consequences. Death metal falls into this latter category. The work ethic of death metal's formative years started a chain of events that brought it into direct contact with the real centres of power within the music industry, with predictably disastrous results. Individual bands wanted to get better at their instruments. They wanted their albums to look better, sound better, to realise the visions of their overactive imaginations. Interest from the music industry was an unintended outgrowth of this. To illustrate this point, one only has to look at the music, artwork, and overall demeanour of death metal prior to 1989, where one will encounter an amateurish beast, a slew of sloppy demos, hand-drawn covers, and rough takes recorded and patched together by sheer will. Distribution was managed through informal networks of underground zines, peer-to-peer tape trading, and the overactive imaginations of young, predominantly men, which drove them to spend hours corresponding through handwritten letters, documenting new bands, and pushing ahead with their own projects. Post-1989, we find a technically demanding genre of metal, both theoretically and practically, slick and polished production jobs with significant recording budgets behind them, servicing albums that were decorated by Dan Seagrave's detailed and enthralling artwork. A mix of organic grassroots activity, working professionals, and individual passion unwittingly turned the diffuse and sloppy collective of death metal from the mid-80s to a slick production line, garnering the interest of real commercial interest within the industry. The tastemakers of Gen X noted its growing popularity in the late 80s and saw a reliable, if modest, revenue stream. At this point, the next chapter for death metal was already written for it, having happened to metal genres that had come before. This was the removal of the underground training wheels, specifically the socially underground elements. The untold power of label bosses, PR firms, radio stations, and magazines was put at the disposal of this crusty upstart genre, wheeling it out before the masses. Prior to the internet, when these monolithic institutions within the music industry turned their attentions to a minnow like death metal, the process could be described as pulling down the barriers that blocked a previously underground genre from the scrutiny of a mass audience. They removed the social underground factors through various signal-boosting tactics, wider distribution, advertising in magazines, PR campaigns, more money behind the recording budgets, and tour management. All are ways of pulling down the walls erected by a genre's underground status and inviting the masses to come in and have a look. But the process goes deeper than this, with commercial interests demanding certain changes to the music itself in order to further monetize it, i.e. a change to the artistically underground elements. Trends and flows of cash are rarely stable in music. The pressure to either adapt to mainstream taste to break the big time, or risk being dropped entirely from a label, proved terminal for a genre whose instincts remained artistically underground, even if it became socially overground. Heavy metal was able to navigate this minefield in the 80s due to its easy accommodation of big-budget theatre. The rockist holdovers of heavy metal allowed its earliest adopters to shapeshift into stadium rock outfits with relatively little friction by the mid-80s. Thrash had also walked this path, albeit with more detours along the way. It managed to flirt with pop success and maintain some structural integrity. Its absorption of groovy hooks or balladeering allowed it to find its way onto primetime MTV by the early 90s. By the early 90s as well, the same mainstreaming pipeline was being plotted out for death metal. TV appearances, major label attention, and ambitious touring schedules were all designed to make this genre available to a wider public. All ended in, if not failure, then only the briefest of successes. Flagship bands like Obituary found their recording sessions turn into a pressure cooker, as expectations of their third album, The End Complete, being the first death metal release to sell 100,000 units, reached fever pitch. Cannibal Corpse turned themselves into an early meme. Chuck Schuldiner alienated anyone close to him in his unending desire to be at the forefront of the genre. But by around 1995, it was apparent that something had gone seriously awry for all parties involved. Labels like Roadrunner were shedding their death metal roster at a rate of knots. Those managing to retain label backing saw their recording budgets slashed. Morbid Angel's brief honeymoon with major label attention via Giant Records swiftly ended. Bands were breaking up or shifting genres by the dozen. The mainstreaming of death metal had ended in utter failure. What went wrong? In short, despite the best efforts of the music industry, death metal remained artistically underground, even as it became socially overground. I put this down to two things. One is that metalhead work ethic again. The enormous amount of free time, effort, and dedication individuals were willing to put into realizing their vision, not to mention the lengths they went to alter their appearance, retain vast quantities of arcane knowledge completely useless outside of a metal setting, and sometimes sacrificing societal acceptance, a career, a family, or whatever, for the sake of metal. The other is specific more to death metal itself. The commercial pipeline usually involves taking an ambitious but plucky young band, dusting them off, and presenting them to the public through PR mediators, label scrutiny, and media filters. But there was an intermediate layer of petty bourgeois promoters, producers, artists, roadies, journalists, and indeed the fans themselves, who all dedicated vast quantities of time, cash, and travel hours to support upcoming bands. This intermediate layer funnels the rough and ready products of the underground up to the professional level through their expertise. Within death metal, these individuals were not just skilled in their own right, exhibiting the same intense work ethic, but just as dedicated to death metal as an artistic endeavour as the musicians themselves. And some are names that are almost as well known. People like the legendary producer Scott Burns, based at Morrisound Studios between 1987 and 1997, and responsible for producing, amongst many others, albums like Slowly We Rot, Beneath the Remains, Spiritual Healing, and Harmony Corruption. Thomas Skogsberg of Sunlight Studios in Sweden, probably the one individual most responsible for putting Sweden and Scandinavia on the death metal map. And Colin Richardson, sometime British rival of Scott Burns, mostly associated with the Earache roster, who cut his teeth with Bolt Thrower, Napalm Death, Carcass, and later he was internationally renowned for his work with everyone from Gorguts, Brutal Truth, Gorefest, and Fear Factory. These people have their fingerprints all over the maturation of this music. They knew it intimately and worked hard to make it the best version of itself it could possibly be. Of course there are others, individual label bosses at Roadrunner, Peaceville, Metal Blade and Nuclear Blast to name a few, but these people, along with the sheer volume and quality of the bands themselves at the time, chugging out raw material to be administered and polished at the mixing desks, they kept death metal true to its underground self, whilst cleaning it up just enough for larger corporate interest to consider it a worthy investment. Incidentally, this is something that black metal would recoil from in disgust, and go to even greater lengths to make it detestable, even to the professional layer of the music industry. Within the bowels of Decibel's recent book on Scott Burns, one comes away with a greater appreciation for how important this death metal work ethic was. The amount of time, labour and passion that went into the foundational documents of death metal's golden age above and beyond the music itself. The scene behind the scenes, recording budgets, demand for progress updates from Roadrunner's A&R man Mont Connor, the lengths musicians went to for the holy grail of guitar tones, and how to edit a duff take before Pro Tools. It requires a steady hand and impeccable timing. Burns could have done the bare minimum required to produce a serviceable product to a deadline for these bands, but instead he put the hours in to supporting bands far beyond the recording process itself, working 7-day weeks, and in the early days studying electrical engineering at the University of South Florida, at the behest of the Morris brothers, whom he attributes much of his early knowledge in recording and producing to. Burns' famed people skills, something celebrated at length in this book, allowed him to mediate the younger names emerging within death metal from Obituary, Ravage and Atheist, Amon and Deicide. He mediated these names into a professional studio setting, making them feel at ease and getting the best performances out of them, whilst reassuring the grown-ups, the Morris brothers and later Roadrunner's Mont Connor for example, that projects would be delivered on time and within budget. Given all this, the growth of death metal from an accident of evolution in the mid-80s to a slick, precision-time production line by 1991 was almost inevitable given both how determined it was to become a better version of itself and just how hawkish the music industry was at this time, at the height of its powers. In the process, bands like Obituary, Massacre, Entombed, At the Gates, Carcass, Napalm Death and countless others capitulated to label pressure by becoming more commercially viable versions of themselves, as it became clear that the fanbase for pure death metal had reached critical mass. But their efforts were still too anti-commercial in spirit when compared to the new generation of alt-new groove metal bands arising at this time for them to make a splash big enough to warrant further investment. Sepultura are something of an exception that proves the rule here. Reading back over this period, the Arise recording sessions were a watershed moment, drawing a clear line in the sand between this layer of intermediate petty bourgeois professionals and the real corridors of power within the music industry. Following Scott Burns' success with Beneath the Remains, and Slowly We Rot for that matter, bands were flocking to him in droves demanding that snare sound amongst other things. Recording Arise under Burns' watchful eye felt like a sure bet, but midway through the sessions, Roadrunner's A&R man Mont Connor took the project off Burns following disagreements over the snare sound. Although both parties insist there was no Professor Umbridge, Sepultura would never again receive the Burns treatment, and given the trajectory of their career from that time, it's clear they had not only outgrown the scene orbiting Morrisound, but death metal entirely. Arise was farmed out to one Andy Wallace, fresh off recording Seasons in the Abyss, and whose next project included some album called Nevermind. This bruised Burns' ego, and set clear limits on the power of those within the scene against the real holders of the purse strings. Sepultura evolved beyond the underground both socially and artistically after Arise, but most of their peers were unable to mirror this success. With the best will in the world, death metal was incapable of being anything other than artistically underground, despite being given the time and resource to make itself socially overground. If the public doesn't want or understand something, you can give it all the finances, distribution, PR campaigns and ad space you want. It will remain underground. Beyond the actual music resulting from this later populist phase of death metal, we only have to look at the weird vectors through which it was transmitted to a bemused public to illustrate this point. MTV, Ace Ventura, Napalm Death on BBC Kids shows.
You've got some brilliant lyrics. I mean, real poetry. Your pride. Why should your pride be so restricted to a mere fraction of this earth from which we all have evolved? I mean, like deep lyrics. But you can't hear them. Why?
All incongruous at best and dripping with sarcasm at worst. The ballads and groove tactics deployed by thrash before it looked dignified by comparison, before it was also put out to pasture in the pastiche uplands as heavy metal had been just a few years before. That death metal was incompatible with commercial success at a molecular, ontological level was not a foregone conclusion. There was, conceivably, a death metal black album waiting to be released by 1992, but something within the genre prohibited it from making the concessions that thrash and heavy metal had done before it. Death metal's achingly sincere desire to be a serious form of music from the outset came into direct conflict not only with the industry's desire to house train this fundamentally anti-mainstream music, but the dramatically changing zeitgeist of the time. A cultural shift that saw the excessive sincerity of the 80s give way to the prohibitive sarcasm of the 90s, which attached an unforgiving irony clause to any cultural consumption. Metal's unconditional love for itself in the 80s looked twee or even laughable by the 90s. The early 90s also saw the beginnings of an alternative music fandom favouring eclecticism over subcultural allegiance, albeit on the most conditional, ironically detached terms. These sarcastic harbingers made death metal a known yet highly misunderstood phenomenon by the turn of the century. The early rumblings of meme culture can be found as far back as this vibe shift. Whilst this form of humour is of course chiefly a product of the internet, in substance the detached, nothing is sacred meta-humour that comprises meme culture, the layers of foreknowledge and cultural understanding required to get the joke, are a status symbol. This last point is key here. The idea that being in on the joke has a cultural cachet, a level of sophistication, a way to signal to others that one is keyed into the vibe of the times by being able to understand its humour with only the most limited visual and textual reference points, something meme culture would leverage to devastating effect. The rise of the hipster heralded the conclusion to this sense of ironic detachment, the imperative to never commit to the moment, lose oneself, appear too enthusiastic, sincere, or genuine. Counterculture shifted away from the pre-digital work ethic of a Scott Burns, the voluntary labour in informal but committed networks of like-minded individuals. It pivoted away from all these things to the production of memes. The energy of the petty bourgeois business ventures turned away from music as sincere and vulnerable as death metal was to a hybrid of indie gestural detachment, or else turning away from music entirely into street food, coffee, and vintage homeware or exposed brick. This shift was foreshadowed by the total disintegration of the infrastructure sustaining death metal, as Roadrunner seemingly couldn't shed its death metal roster fast enough to make way for industrial and nu metal being popularized at the time, or the precious little financial support a few bands did cobble together dissolving at the mass adoption of early file sharing. The new blood that did arrive insisted on aping old, who in turn were unable or unwilling to sustain this monstrous vision they had helped to create into another century.
Kings made tombs more splendid than the houses of the living, and counted the old names of their descent dearer than the names of their sons.
But the vibe shift towards meme culture allowed metal, and death metal in particular, to take on a new kind of half-life. Death metal by the mid-90s was a joke, a punchline on Beavis and Butthead if it was acknowledged at all. But the rise of meme culture, this turned out to be an important weapon in its arsenal. It was a joke, and it's one that people wanted to be in on.
No, more throats.
In this sense, as far as mainstream acceptance is concerned, death metal was given two bites of the cherry, one in 1994 and another in the 2010s. History repeats, first as shibboleth, then as farce. Much like black metal, and unlike the preceding waves of radio-friendly heavy and thrash metal, the more recent and amicable accord between death metal and mainstream attention pivots not on music but vibe. Death metal worked its way into the collective psyche by functioning as a touchstone of extremity, a yardstick of violence and vulgarity. Normal culture is free to use its signifiers, both musical and aesthetic, to contextualize itself. Delegates of pop culture take endless joy in humorously testing their boundaries against the genre that can always be relied upon to go too far. In turn, the hipsters sought to analyze, borrow, and otherwise dissect its content to certify their credentials as cultural understanders. Metal likes to pride itself on its durability and dedicated fanbase, but it's easy to forget that both commercially and artistically it had a near-death experience by the late 90s, existing on life support throughout the early 2000s. It was only resurrected by a flurry of grassroots activity from a newer generation. This second wind for death metal did not see a renewed creativity within the scene, rather surviving on pure pastiche of death metal's heyday. But the unrelenting popularity of old-school death metal was no doubt fueled by a wider music-loving public keen to be in on the joke, as it were, and advertise their understanding of a genre considered by many to be the go-to reference point of sonic extremity. And so it continues in a kind of half-life based on memes and vibes, echoes of a brief moment when the genre was professional enough to be taken seriously but not completely beholden to the tendrils of the music industry. Is death metal still underground? In the sense that true knowledge and passion for this music remains the preserve of relatively few individuals, although admittedly far more than at any other point in its history, then yes, it's still underground. Even those with the inclination to take advantage of all that instantaneously accessible information are liable to come out with only a partial or misguided understanding of its history. Scratch beneath the surface with any modern fan, and I'd wager that you'd soon know whether they'd been frantically absorbing trivia for a matter of months, or immersed in the material over many, many years. There are then, in a sense, two tiers of undergrounding going on here. One is the just so stories told by the Finn McKenties of the world. The agreed facts, established canon, key players and milestones, all accessible through a 2-minute Google search. The other is the more granular, scholarly, detailed rendition of its history and evolution based on careful study of the music in all its facets, not just the releases that have stood the test of time, and the contested history that we are still trying to understand to this day, along with an acquaintance with the first-hand testimonials and other relevant primary source material that wouldn't necessarily appear at the top of a Google search. And then of course there's mainstream discourse as it exists in the eyes of a non-metal music-loving public, namely through memes, Blood Incantation albums, and Napalm Death appearances at Glastonbury. Forms of idle amusement for a wider audience, holdovers of death metal's disastrous brush with mainstream attention in the mid-90s. In order for death metal, or at least its ancestors, to return to a more authentically underground state, one whose practices are, per Wikipedia, perceived as outside or somehow opposed to mainstream popular music culture, one lacking the commercial success of popular music movements, and may involve the use of avant-garde or abrasive approaches, it must, in a sense, undergo a reversal of the process of professionalisation it underwent in the late 80s. The work ethic of the Scott Burnses of the world, admirable as it was, unintentionally created a monster, one defined by a homogeneous sound, a steady churn of new releases, a slick but uniform aesthetic, and both a commercially and artistically aspirational ethos. By hermetically sealing itself off from these impulses, resisting the demands for regular content placed on it by social media, the availability of decent recording technology and eye-catching artwork, one creates space and time for imaginations to wander once again, for accidents to occur, for the artists to once again lose a degree of control over their creations, and resurface with something equally bizarre, problematic, and in all likelihood just as short-lived as the original incarnation of pre-89 death metal. Given that this is, for all intents and purposes, absolutely impossible, there's a very real sense in which the underground is indeed dead, or at least no longer possible as we once knew it. The observer effect holds that a thing necessarily changes when it is being observed. For death metal, this holds true even if the observation is only theoretical. It's a detestable creature that no one in the real world actually wants, but they could nevertheless access and scrutinize it at a moment's notice should they choose. The fact that any artistically underground genre is even potentially observable by anyone directly impacts how it behaves. In other words, a threat to its social undergroundness degrades its ability to remain artistically underground. One can no longer create in isolation, freedom, or opposition.